Genesis. Exodus. "Why do you want me to go?" I asked her the night before. "Because if you don't go, I'll have to go to prison." She picked up the knife. "How many slices do you want?" "2, I said. "What's going in them?" "Potted beef, and be thankful." "But if you go to prison, you'll get out again. St. Paul was always going to prison." "I know that." She cut the bread firmly, so that only the tiniest squirt of potted beef oozed out. "But the neighbours don't. Eat this and be quiet." She pushed the plate in front of me. It looked horrible. "Why can't we have chips?" "Because I don't have time to make you chips. There's my feet to soak, your vest to iron, and I haven't touched all those requests for prayer. Besides, there's no potatoes." I went into the living room, looking for something to do. In the kitchen, I heard my mother switch on the radio. "And now," said a voice, "a program about the family life of snails." My mother shrieked. "Did you hear that?" she demanded, and poked her head around the kitchen door. "The family life of snails? It's an abomination. It's like saying we come from monkeys." I thought about it. Mr. and Mrs. Snail at home on a wet Wednesday night. Mr. Snail dozing quietly, Mrs. Snail reading a book about difficult children. "I'm so worried, Doctor. He's so quiet, won't come out of his shell." "No, Mum," I replied. "It's not like that at all." But she wasn't listening. She had gone back into the kitchen, and I could hear her muttering to herself against the static as she fiddled for the World Service. I went after her. "The devil's in the world, but not in the house," she said, and fixed her gaze on the picture of the Lord hung about the oven. It was a watercolour about 9 inches square, painted by Pastor Spratt for my mother, before he left with his glory crusade for Wigan and Africa. It was called "The Lord of Feeding the Birds," and my mother put it over the oven because she spent most of her time there, making things for the faithful. It was a bit battered now, and the Lord had a blob of egg on one foot, but we didn't like to touch it in case the paint came off too. "I've had enough," she said. "Go away." And she closed the kitchen door again and switched off the radio. I could hear her humming, "Glorious things of thee are spoken." Well, that's that then, I thought, and it was. The next morning was a hive of activity. My mother dragged me out of bed, shouting that it was 7:30, and that she had had no sleep at all, and that my dad had gone to work without his dinner. She poured a scalding kettle of water into the sink. "Why didn't you go to bed?" I asked her. "No point if I had to get up with you 3 hours later." She shot a jet of cold water into the hot. "Well, you could have had an early night," I suggested, struggling with my pyjama top. An old woman had made it for me, and made the neck holes same size as the armholes, so I always had sore ears. Once I went deaf for 3 months with my adenoids. No one noticed that either. I was lying in bed one night, thinking about the glory of the Lord, when it struck me that life had gone very quiet. I had been to church as usual, sung as loudly as ever, but it had seemed for some time that I was the only one making a noise. I had assumed myself to be in a state of rapture, not uncommon in our church, and later I discovered my mother had assumed the same. When May had asked why I wasn't answering anybody, my mother said, "It's the Lord." "What's the Lord?" May was confused. "Working in mysterious ways," declared my mother, and walked ahead. So, unknown to me, word spread about our church that I was in a state of rapture, and no one should speak to me. "Why do you think it's happened?" Mrs. White wanted to know. "Oh, it's not surprising. She's 7, you know." May paused for effect. "It's a holy number. Strange things happen in 7s. Look at Elsie Norris." Elsie Norris, testifying Elsie, as she was called, was a great encouragement to our church. Whenever the pastor asked for testimony on God's kindness, Elsie leapt to her feet and cried, "Listen to what the Lord has done for me this week." She needed eggs. The Lord had sent them. She had a bout of colic, The Lord took it away. She always prayed for 2 hours a day, once in the morning at 7 a.m. and once in the evening at 7 p.m. Her hobby was numerology, and she never read the word without first casting the dice to guide her. 1 dice for the chapter and 1 dice for the verse was her motto. Someone once asked her what she did for books of the Bible. Someone once asked her what she did for books of the Bible that had more than 6 chapters. "I have my ways," she said stiffly, "and the Lord has his." I liked her a lot because she had interesting things in her house. She had an organ that you had to pedal if you wanted it to make noise. God, I'm sorry, Sophie, I fucking suck at reading. That is not in the book, but whatever. Anyway. She had an organ that whenever you pedal, you wanted it... Fuck. She had an organ that you had to pedal if you wanted it to make noise, and not... Yeah! Whatever. If you wanted it to make a noise. Whenever I went there, she played Lead Kindly Night. Her doing the keys and me doing the pedals because she had asthma. She collected foreign coins and kept them in a glass case that smelled of linseed oil. She said it reminded her of her late husband, who had used to play cricket for Lancashire. Hard Hand Stan, they called him, she said every time I went to see her. She could never remember what she told people. She could never remember how long she had kept her fruit cake. There was a time when I got offered the same piece of cake for 5 weeks. I was lucky. She never remembered what you said to her either, so every week I made the same excuse. Colic, I said. I'll pray for you, she said. Best of all, she had a collage of Noah's Ark. It showed the 2 parent Noahs leaning out looking at the flood, while the other Noahs tried to catch one of the rabbits. But for me, the delight was a detachable chimpanzee, made out of a Brillo pad. At the end of my visit, she let me play with it for 5 minutes. I had all kinds of variations, but usually I drowned it. One Sunday, the pastor told everyone how full of the Spirit I was. He talked about me for 20 minutes, and I didn't hear a word, just sat there reading my Bible and thinking what a long book it was. Of course, this seeming modesty made them all the more convinced. I thought no one was talking to me, and the others thought I wasn't talking to them. But on the night I realised I couldn't hear anything, I went downstairs and... Fuck! Okay. I thought no one was talking to me, and the others thought I wasn't talking to them. But on the night I realised I couldn't hear anything. I went downstairs and wrote on a piece of paper, "Mother, the world is very quiet." My mother nodded and carried on with her book. She had got it in the post that morning from Pastor Spratt. It was a description of a missionary life called Other Continents Know Him Too. I couldn't attract her attention, so I took an orange and went back to bed. I had to find out for myself. Someone had given me a recorder and a tune book for my birthday, so I propped myself up against the pillows and piped out a couple verses of Auld Lang Syne. I could see my fingers moving, but there was no sound. I tried Little Brown Jug. Nothing. In despair, I started to beat out the rhythm section of Old Man River. Nothing. And nothing I could do till morning. The next day I leapt out of bed, determined to explain to my mother what was wrong. There was no one in the house. My breakfast had been left on the kitchenette with a short note. Dear Jeanette, we have gone to the hospital to pray for Auntie Betty. Her leg is very loose. Love, Mother. So I spent the day as well as I could, and finally decided to go for a walk. That walk was my salvation. I met Miss Dewsbury, who played the oboe and conducted the sisterhood choir. She was very clever. But she's not holy, Mrs. Whitehead once said. Miss Dewsbury must have said hello to me, and I must have ignored her. She hadn't been to church for a long time because of her tour of the Midlands with the Salvation Symphony Orchestra, and so she didn't know that I was supposed to be full of the Spirit. She stood in front of me, opening and shutting her mouth, which was very large on account of the oboe, and pulling her eyebrows into the middle of her head. I took hold of her and led her to the post office. Then I picked up one of the pens and wrote on the back of the child allowance form. Dear Miss Dewsbury, I can't hear a thing. She looked at me in horror, and, taking the pen herself, wrote, What is your mother doing about it? Why aren't you in bed? By now there was no room left on the child allowance form, so I had to use who to contact in an event of an emergency. Dear Miss Dewsbury, I wrote, My mother doesn't know. She's at the hospital with Auntie Betty. I was in bed last night. Miss Dewsbury just stared and stared. She stared for so long I began to think about going home. Then she snatched my hand and whisked me off to the hospital. When we got there, my mother and some others were gathered around Auntie Betty's bed, singing choruses. My mother saw us, looked a bit surprised, but didn't get up. Miss Dewsbury tapped on her elbow and started doing the routine with her mouth and eyebrows. My mother just shook her head. Finally, Miss Dewsbury yelled so loud even I heard it. This child's not full of the spirit, she screamed. She's deaf. Everyone in the hospital had turned to peer at me. I went very red and stared at Auntie Betty's water jug. The worst thing was not knowing at all what was going on. Then a doctor came over to us, very angry, and then he and Miss Dewsbury waved their arms at each other. The faithful had gone back to their chorus sheets as though nothing was happening at all. The doctor and Miss Dewsbury whisked me away to a cold room full of equipment and made me lie down. The doctor kept tapping me in different places and shaking his head, and it was all absolutely silent. Then my mother arrived and seemed to understand what was going on. She signed a form and wrote me another note. Dear Jeanette, there's nothing wrong, you're just a bit deaf. Why didn't you tell me? I'm going home to get your pajamas. What was she doing? Why was she leaving me here? I started to cry. My mother looked horrified, and rooting in her handbag she gave me an orange. I peeled it to comfort myself, and seeing me a little calmer, everyone glanced at one another and went away. Since I was born, I had assumed that the world ran on very simple lines, like a larger version of our church. Now I was finding that even the church was sometimes confused. This was a problem, but not one I chose to deal with for many years more. The problem there and then was what was going on. The problem there and then was what. Oh my god. Okay. The problem there and then was what was going to happen to me. The Victoria Hospital was big and frightening, and I couldn't even sing to any effect because I couldn't hear what I was singing. There was nothing to read except some dental notices and an instruction leaflet for the X-ray machine. I tried to build an igloo out of the orange peel, but it kept falling down, and even when it stood up, I didn't have an Eskimo to put in it, so I had to invent a story about how Eskimo got eaten, which made me even more miserable. It's always the same with diversions. You get involved. At last my mother came back, and a nurse pulled me into pajamas and took us both to the children's ward. It was horrid. The walls were pale pink, and all the curtains had animals on them. Not real animals, though. Fluffy ones playing games with coloured balls. I thought of the sea walrus I had just invented. It was wicked. It had eaten the Eskimo. But it was better than these. The nurse had thrown my igloo in the bin. There was nothing for me to do but to contemplate my fate and lie still. A couple of hours later, my mother returned with my Bible, a Scripture Union colouring book, and a wedge of plasticine, which the nurse took away. I pulled a face, and she wrote on a card, "Not nice, might swallow." I looked at her and wrote back, "I don't want to swallow it, I want to build with it. Besides, plasticine isn't toxic, it tells you on the back." And I waved the packet at her. She frowned and shook her head. I turned to my mother for support, but she was scribbling me a long letter. The nurse started to rearrange my bed, and put the offending putty in her uniform pocket. I could see that nothing would change her mind. I sniffed. Disinfectant and mashed potatoes. Then my mother prodded me, put her letter on the bedside cabinet, and emptied a huge carrier bag of oranges into the bowl by my water jug. I smiled feebly, hoping to gain support, but instead she patted me on the head and rolled away. So I was alone. I thought of Jane Eyre, who faced many trials and was always brave. My mother read the book to me whenever she felt sad. She said it gave her fortitude. Nope. Yeah, no. My mother read the book to me whenever she felt sad. She said it gave her fortitude. I picked up her letter. The usual, not to worry, lots of people will visit, chin up, and a promise to work hard on the bathroom, and not let Mrs. White get in the way. Then she'd come soon, or if not, she'd send her husband. That my operation would be the next day. At this, I let the letter fall to the bed. The next day? What if I died? So young and so promising. I thought of my funeral, all the tears. I wanted to be buried with Golly and my Bible. Should I write instructions? Could I count on any of them to take any notice? I fucking suck at reading, sorry. My mother knew all about illness and operations. The doctor had told her that a woman in her condition shouldn't be walking around, but she said that her time hadn't come, and at least she knew where she was going, not like him. My mother read in a book that more people die under anesthetic than drown while water skiing. If the Lord brings you back, she told May, before she went in for her gallstones, you'll know it's because he's got work for you to do. I crept under the bedcloth and prayed to be brought back. On the morning of my operation, the nurses were smiling and rearranging the bed again and piling the oranges in a symmetrical tower. 2 hairy arms lifted me up and strapped me onto a cold trolley. The casters squeaked and the man who pushed me went too fast. Corridors, double doors, and 2 pairs of eyes peeping over top of tight white masks. A nurse held my hand while someone fitted a muzzle over my nose and mouth. I breathed in and saw a great line of water skiers falling off and not coming back up. Then I didn't see anything at all. Jelly? Jeanette? I knew it. I died and the angels were giving me jelly. I opened my eyes and expected to see a pair of wings. Come on, eat up, the voice encouraged. Are you an angel? I asked hopefully. Not quite. I'm a doctor. But she's an angel, aren't you, nurse? The angel blushed. I can hear, I said, to no one in particular. Eat your jelly, said the nurse. I might have languished alone for the rest of the week if Elsie hadn't found out where I was and started visiting me. My mother couldn't come till the weekend, I knew that, because she was waiting for the plumber to check her fittings. Elsie came every day and told me jokes to make me smile and stories to make me feel better. She said stories helped you to understand the world. When I felt better, she promised to show me the basics I needed to help her with numerology. A thrill of excitement ran through me because I knew my mother disapproved. She said it was too close to madness. Never mind that, said Elsie. It works. So we had quite a good time, the 2 of us, planning what we'd do when I got better. How old are you, Elsie? I wanted to know. I remember the Great War, and that's all I'm saying. Then she started to tell me how she'd driven an ambulance without any brakes. My mother came to see me quite a lot in the end, but it was busy season at church. They were planning the Christmas campaign. When she couldn't come herself, she sent my father, usually with a letter and a couple of oranges. The only fruit, she always said. Fruit salad, fruit pie, fruit for fools, fruited punch, demon fruit, passion fruit, rotten fruit, fruit on Sunday. Oranges are the only fruit. I filled my little bucket with peel, and the nurses emptied it with an ill grace. I hid the peel under my pillow, and the nurses scolded and sighed. Elsie Norris and me ate an orange every day, half each. Elsie had no teeth, so she sucked and champed. C-H-A-M-P-E-D. Champed? I dropped my pieces like oysters, far back into the throat. People used to watch us, but we didn't mind. When Elsie wasn't reading the Bible or telling stories, she spent time with the poets. She told me all about Swinburne and his troubles, and all about the oppression of William Blake. No one listens to the eccentrics, she said. No one listens to eccentrics, she said. When I was sad, she'd read me Goblin Market by a woman called Christina Rossetti, whose friend once gave her a pickled mouse in a jar for a present. But of all her loves, Elsie's favourite was W.B. Yeats. Yeats, she said, knew the importance of numbers and the great effect of the imagination on the world. What looks like one thing, she told me, may well be another. I was reminded of my orange peel igloo. If you think about something for long enough, she explained, more than likely that thing will happen. She tapped her head. It's all in the mind. My mother believed that if you prayed for something long enough, it happened. I asked Elsie if that was the same thing. God's in everything, she said thoughtfully, so it's always the same thing. I had a feeling my mother would disagree, but she wasn't there, so it didn't matter. I played Ludo with Elsie and Hang the Man, and she took to reading me a poem just before she left at the end of visiting time. One of them had these lines in it. All things fall and are built again, and those that build them... Okay. Jesus. One of them had these lines in it. All things fall and are built again, and those that build them again are gay. Yeah. I understood this because I had been working on my orange peel igloo for weeks. It means gay happy. Sorry. And those that build them again are gay. Right, okay. Anyway. I understood this because I had been working on my orange peel igloo for weeks. Some days were a great disappointment, others a near triumph. It was a feat of balance and vision. Elsie was always encouraging and told me not to mind the nurses. It would have been easier with plasticine, I complained one day. Sorry. But less interesting, she said. When I finally left the hospital, my hearing had been restored, and my confidence recovered, thanks to her. I had to go and stay with Elsie for a couple of days until my mother got home from Wigan, where she was auditing the Society for the Lost. I found a new piece of sheet music, she said, on the bus. It's got an interlude for 7 elephants in it. What's it called? The Battle of Abyssinia. The Battle of Abyssinia. Which is, of course, a very famous bit of Victorian sentiment, like Prince Albert. Anything else? Not really. The Lord and I don't bother with each other just now. It comes and goes, so I've been doing a bit of decorating while I can. Nothing fancy, just a dab on the skirting boards, but when I'm with the Lord, I haven't time for anything. When we got home, she came over all mysterious, and told me to wait in the parlour. I could hear her rustling and muttering, and then I heard something squeaking. At last she pushed open the door, wheezing loudly. God forgive me, she panted, but it's a bugger. And she plonked a large box on the table. Open it then. What is it? Never mind that, open it. I pulled off the wrapper. It was a domed wooden box with 3 white mice inside. Ooh. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. She stretched her gums at me into a smile. Look, I painted them flames myself. Meself. The back of the box was a wash of angry orange paint shaped into the tongues. Sorry. The back of the box was a wash of angry orange paint shaped into tongues of flame. It could even be Pentecost, I suggested. Oh yes, it's very versatile, she agreed. The mice took no notice. And see, I made these too. She shuffled in her bag and pulled out 2 plywood figures. They were both painted very bright, but it was so obvious that one was celestial from the wings. She looked at me triumphant. Nebuchadnezzar and the angel of the Lord. The angel had little slits in his base that helped him to fit on the top of the dome without disturbing the mice. It's beautiful, I said. I know, she nodded, dropping a bit of cheese past the angel. That evening we made some scones and sat by the fire. She had an old fireplace with pictures of famous men and Florence Nightingale printed onto the tiles. Clive of India was there, and Palmerston, and Sir Isaac Newton with a signed chin where the fire roared too high. Oh, singed. With a singed chin. Elsie showed me her holy dice, bought in Mecca 40 years ago. She kept them in a box behind the chimney breast in case of thieves. Some folks say I'm a fool, but there's more to this world than meets the eye. I waited quietly. There's this world, she banged the wall graphically, and there's this world, she thumped her chest. If you want to make sense of either, you have to take notice of both. I don't understand, I sighed, thinking of what to ask next to make it clearer, but she had fallen asleep with her mouth open, and besides, there were the mice to feed. Perhaps I'll find out when I get to school, was my only consolation, as the hours ticked past and Elsie didn't wake up. Even when she did wake up, she seemed to have forgotten all about her explanation of the universe, and wanted to build a tunnel for the mice. I don't find many explanations at school though either. It only got more and more complex. After 3 terms I was beginning to despair. I'd learnt country dancing and the rudiments of needlework, but not a great deal more. Country dancing was 33 rickety kids in black plimsolls and green knickers trying to keep up with Miss, who always danced with Sir anyway and never looked at anybody else. They got engaged soon after, but it didn't do us any good because they started going in for ballroom competitions, which meant they spent all of our lessons practicing their footwork while we shuffled up and down to the recorded instructions on the gramophone. The threats were the worst, being forced to hold hands with somebody you hated. We flapped along twisting each other's fingers off and promising untold horrors as soon as the lesson was over. Tired of being bullied, I became adept at inventing the most fundamental tortures under the guise of sweet sainthood. What, me, miss? No, miss. Oh, miss, I never did. But I did. I always did. The most frightening for the girls was the offer of total immersion in the cesspit round the back. The most frightening for the girls was the offer of total immersion in the cesspit round the back of the Rathbones wrought iron. For the boys, anything that involved their willies. Ew. Okay. And so, 3 times later, I squatted down in the shoe bags and got depressed. The shoe bag room was dark and smelly. It was always smelly, even at the beginning of terms. You can't get rid of feet, I heard the caretaker say sourly. The cleaning lady shook her head. She'd got rid of more smells than she's eaten hot dinners. She had even worked in a zoo once. And you know how them animals stink? But the feet had beaten her. This stuff takes the seals off the floors, she said, waving a red tin, but it don't shift feet. We didn't really notice after a week or so, and besides, it was a good place to hide. The teachers didn't come near it, except to supervise a few yards away from the door. The last day of term, we'd been on a school trip to Chester Zoo earlier in the week. That meant everybody in their Sunday best, vying for who had the cleanest socks and the most impressive sandwiches. Canned drinks were our envy, since most of us had orange squash in Tupperware pots. The Tupperware always heated up and burnt our mouths. You've got brown bread. Scuffling over the seats came 3 heads. What's that for? It's got bits in it. You vegetarian? I try not to take any notice as my sandwiches are prodded. The general sandwich inspection continues from seat to seat, alternating between the murmurs of envy and shrieks of laughter. Susan Green had cold fish fingers in hers because her family were very poor and had to eat leftovers even if they were horrible. Last time she'd only had brown sauce because there weren't even any leftovers. The inspectorate decided that Shelley had the best. bright white rolls stuffed with curried egg and a dash of parsley, and she had a can of lemonade. The zoo itself was not exciting, and we had to walk in twos. Our crocodile weaved in and out, ruining new shoes with sand and sawdust, sweating and sticking to each other. Stanley Farmer slipped into the flamingo pond, and nobody had any money to buy model animals. So, an hour early, we trooped back onto our coach and jogged home. 3 plastic bags full of sick and hundreds of sweet wrappers were our memento to the driver. It was all we could part with. Never again, heaved Mrs. Virtue, herding us out onto the street. Never again will I risk disgrace. Right now, Mrs. Virtue was helping Shelley finish her summer party dress. They deserve each other, I thought. I comforted myself with the thought of summer camp our church went on. I comforted myself with the thought of the summer camp our church went on each year. This time we were going far away, to Devon. You're in Devon right now, by the way. This bit is not in the book, but you're in Devon right now. And I also love you lots. Anyway. This time we were going far away, to Devon. My mother was very excited because Pastor Spratt had promised to call in one of his rare visits to England. He was to take the first Sunday service in the gospel tent just outside Cullompton. At the moment, Pastor Spratt was touring his exhibition in Europe. He was fast becoming one of the most famous and successful missionaries that our group of churches had ever sent out. Tribesmen from places we couldn't pronounce sent thank you letters to our headquarters, rejoicing in the Lord and their new salvation. To celebrate his 10,000th convent, the pastor had been funded to take a long holiday and tour his collection of weapons, amulets, idols, and primitive methods of contraception. The exhibition was called Saved by Grace Alone. I had only seen the leaflet, but my mother had all the details. Apart from Pastor Spratt, we had planned a careful campaign for the farming folk of Devon. In the past, we had always used the same techniques, whether in a tent or in a town hall, and regardless of the location. Then our campaign secretary had received an action kit from headquarters, explaining that the second coming might be at any time, and it was up to us to pull Then our campaign secretary had received an action kit from headquarters, explaining that the second coming might be at any time, and it was up to us to put all our efforts into saving souls. The action kit, which had been specially designed by the Charismatic Movement Marketing Council, explained that people are different and needed a different approach. People are different and need a different approach. You had to make salvation relevant to them and to their minds. So if you visited a sea people, you used sea metaphors to pass on the message. And most important, when talking to individuals, you determined, as soon as you could, what they wanted most in life, and of what they were most afraid. This made the message immediately relevant. The council set us training weekends for all those engaged in the good fight, and gave out graphs so that we could monitor any improvements and be encouraged. Pastor Spratt had written a personal recommendation on the back of the kits. There was a photo of him too, much younger, baptizing a chief. So, our aim was to prove the Lord relevant to the farming folk of Devon. My mother was in charge of the camp stores, and had already started to buy in huge tins of beans and frankfurter sausages. An army marches on its stomach, she told me. We were hoping to make enough converts to start a new church in Exeter. Oh, I think that's exactly where you are. Okay, anyway. We were hoping to make enough converts to start a new church in Exeter. I remember when we built the gospel hall here, said my mother wistfully, all of us pulling together, and we only used born-again workmen. It had been a bright, difficult time, saving up for a piano and hymn books, fending off the temptations of the devil to go on holiday instead. Of course, your father was a card player in those days. Eventually, they had got a grant from head office to finish the roof and pay for a flag to fly from the top. It was a proud day when they hoisted the flag, with "Seek ye the Lord" embroidered in red letters. All the churches had flags, made by disabled missionaries. It was a way of helping out their pension and giving them spiritual satisfaction. During the first year, my mother had gone into all the pubs and clubs, urging the drunkards to join her church. She used to sit at the piano and sing, "Have you any room for Jesus?" It was very moving, she said. The men cried into their tankards and stopped playing snooker while she sang. She was plump and pretty, and they called her the Jesus Belle. "Oh, I had my offers," she confided, "and they weren't all godly." Wherever they were, the church grew, and many a man will stop in the street when my mother goes past and raise his hat to the Jesus Belle. Sometimes I think she married in haste. After her awful time with Pierre, she wanted no more upsets. When I sat by her looking through the photograph album at ancestors with stern faces, she always stopped at the 2 pages called Old Flames in the index. Pierre was there, and others including my father. "Why didn't you marry that one, or that one?" I asked, curious. "They were all wayward men," she sighed. "I had a bad time enough finding one that was only a gambler." "Why isn't he a gambler now?" I wanted to know, trying to imagine my meek father looking like the men I'd seen on the films. "He married me and he found the Lord." Then she sighed and told me the story of each of the He married me and he found the Lord. Then she sighed and told me the story of each one of the old flames. Mad Percy, who drove an open-topped car and asked her to live with him in Brighton. Eddie with the tortoise-shell glasses who kept bees. Right at the bottom of the page was a yellowy picture of a pretty woman holding a cat. "Who's that?" I pointed. "That? Oh, just Eddie's sister. I don't know why... Oh, just Eddie's sister. I don't know why I put it in there." She turned the page. "Next time we looked, it had gone." Okay. So she married my father and reformed him, and he built the church and never got angry. I thought he was nice, though he didn't say much. Of course, her own father was furious. He told me she'd married down, that she should have stayed in Paris, and promptly ended all communication. So she never had enough money, and after a while she managed to forget that she'd ever had any at all. "The church is my family," she said whenever I asked her about the people in the photograph album, and the church was my family too. At school I couldn't seem to learn anything or win anything, not even the draw to get out of being dinner monitor. Dinner monitor meant that you had to make sure everybody had a plate and that the water jug didn't have bits in it. Ew. Dinner monitors got served last and had the smallest portions. I'd been drawn to do it 3 times running, and I got shouted at in class for always smelling of gravy. My clothes were gravy spotted, and my mother made me wear the same gym slip all week because she said there was no point in trying to make me look clean as long as I had that duty. Now I was sitting in the shoe bags with liver and onions all down my front. Sometimes I tried to clean it off, but today I was too unhappy. After 6 weeks holiday with our church, I'd be even less able to cope with any of it. My mother was right. It was a breeding ground, and it wasn't as though I hadn't tried. At first I'd done my very best to fit in and be good. We had been set a project just before we started last autumn. What? We had been set a project just before we started last autumn. We had to write an essay called "What I Did in My Summer Holiday." I was anxious to do it well because I knew they thought I couldn't read or anything, not having been to school early enough. I did it slowly in my best handwriting, proud that some of the others could only print. We read them out one by one, then gave them to the teacher. It was all the same: fishing, swimming, picnics, Walt Disney. 32 essays about gardens and frog spawn. I was the end of the alphabet, and I could hardly wait. The teacher was the kind of woman who wanted her class to be happy. She called us lambs, and told me in particular not to worry if I found anything difficult. "You'll soon fit in," she soothed. I wanted to please her, and trembling with anticipation I started my essay. "This holiday I went to Colwyn Bay with our church camp." The teacher nodded and smiled. "It was very hot, and Auntie Betty, whose leg was loose anyway, got sunstroke, and we thought she might die." The teacher began to look a bit worried, but the class piped up. "But she got better, thanks to my mother, who stayed up all night struggling mightily." "Is your mother a nurse?" asked the teacher, with quiet sympathy. "No, she just heals the sick." The teacher frowned. "Well, carry on then." "When Auntie Betty got better, we all went in the bus to Llandudno to testify on the beach. I played the tambourine, and Elsie Norris bought her accordion, but a boy threw some sand, and since then she's had no F sharp. We're going to have a jumble sale in the autumn to try and pay for it. When we went back from Colwyn Bay, next door had another baby, but there are so many of them next door we don't know whose it is. My mother gave them some potatoes from the yard, but they said they weren't a charity and threw them back over the wall." The class had gone very quiet. The teacher looked at me. "Is there any more?" "Yes, 2 more sides." "What about?" "Not much, just how we hired the baths for our baptism service after the healing of the sick crusade." "Very good, but I don't think we'll have time today. Put your work back in your tidy box and do some colouring till playtime." The class giggled. Slowly I sat down, not sure what was going on, but sure that something was. When I got home, I told my mother I didn't want to go again. "You've got to," she said. "Here, have an orange." Some weeks passed, in which I tried to make myself as ordinary as possible. It seemed like it was working, and then we started sewing class on Wednesdays after Toad in the Hole and Manchester tart. We did our cross-stitch and chain-stitch, and then we had to think of a project. I decided to make a sampler for Elsie Norris. The girl next to me wanted to do one for her mother. "To Mother with Love," the girl opposite a birthday motif. When it came to me, I said I wanted a text. "What about Suffer Little Children?" suggested Mrs. Virtue. I knew that wouldn't... What the fuck is that? I knew that wouldn't do for Elsie. She liked the prophets. "No," I said firmly. "It's for my friend. She reads Jeremiah mostly. I was thinking of The summer is ended and we are not yet saved." Mrs. Virtue was a diplomatic woman, but she had her blind spots. When it came to listing all the samplers, she wrote the others out in full, and next to mine put text. "Why's that?" I asked. "You might upset the others," she said. "Now what colour do you want? Yellow, green, or red?" We looked at each other. "Black," I said. I did upset the children, not intentionally but effectively. Mrs. Sparrow and Mrs. Spencer came to school one day all fluffed up with rage. They came at playtime. I saw them with their handbags and hats, revolving up the concrete. Lips pursed. Mrs. Spencer had her gloves on. Some of the others knew what was happening. There was a little group of them by the fence, whispering. One of them pointed at me. I tried not to notice and carried on with my whip and top. The group got bigger. A girl with sherbet on her mouth yelled across at me. I didn't catch what she said, but the others all screamed with laughter. Then a boy came and hit me on the neck, and then another and another, all hitting and running off. "Tag! Tag!" they cried as teacher came past. I was bewildered, then angry, in the stomach angry. I caught one with my little whip. He yelped. "Miss, Miss, she hit me! Miss, Miss, she hit him!" chorused the rest. Miss took me by the back of my hair and hauled me off inside. Outside the bell rang. There was noise and doors and scuffling, then quiet. That particular corridor quiet. I was in the staff room. Miss turned to me. She looked tired. "Hold out your hand." I held out my hand. She reached for the ruler. I thought of the Lord. The staff room door had opened, and in walked Mrs. Vole, the head. "Ah, I see Jeanette is here already. Wait outside a moment, will you?" I withdrew my sacrificial palm, shoved it into my pocket, and slid out between them. I was just in time to see the retreating shapes of Mrs. Spencer and Mrs. Sparrow, ripe plumps of indignation falling from them. It was cold in the corridor. I could hear low voices behind the door, but nothing happened. I started to pick at the radiator with my compass, trying to make a bit of warped plastic look like Paris from the air. Last night at church had been the prayer meeting, and Mrs. White had a vision. What was it like? We asked eagerly. Oh, it was very holy, said Mrs. White. The plans for the Christmas campaign were well underway. We had got permission from the Salvation Army to share their crib space outside the town hall, and rumour had it that Pastor Spratt might be back with some of the converted heathen. We can only hope and pray, said my mother, writing to him at once. I had won yet another Bible quiz competition, and to my great relief I had been picked as narrator for the Sunday school pageant. I had been Mary for the last 3 years, and there was nothing else I could bring to the part. Besides, it meant playing opposite Stanley Farmer. It was clear and warm and made me happy. At school, there was only confusion. By this time, I had squatted on the floor, so when the door finally opened, all I could see were wool stockings and hush puppies. We'd like to talk to you, said Mrs. Vole. I scrambled up and went inside, feeling like Daniel. Mrs. Vole picked up an inkwell and looked at me carefully. Jeanette, we think you may be having problems at school. Do you want to tell us about them? I'm all right, I shuffled defensively. You do seem rather preoccupied, shall we say, with God. I continued to stare at the floor. Your sampler, for instance, had a very disturbing motif. It was for my friend. She liked it. I burst out, thinking of how Elsie's face had lit up when I had given it to her. And who's your friend? She's called Elsie Norris, and she gave me 3 mice in the fiery furnace. Mrs. Vole and Miss looked at one another. And why did you choose to write about hoo-poos and rock badgers in your animal book? And in one case, I believe, shrimps? My mother taught me to read, I told them rather desperately. Yes, your reading skills are quite unusual, but you haven't answered my question. How could I? My mother had taught me to read from the book of Deuteronomy, because it is full of animals, mostly unclean. Whenever we read, Thou shalt not eat any beast that does not chew the cud or part the hoof, she drew all the creatures mentioned. Horses, bunnies, and little ducks were vague, fabulous things, but I knew all about pelicans, rock badgers, sloths, and bats. This tendency towards the exotic has brought me many problems, just as it did for William Blake. My mother drew winged insects and the birds of the air, but my favourite ones were the seabird ones, the mollusks. I had a fine collection from the beach at Blackpool. She had a blue pen for the waves and brown ink for the scaly-backed crab. Lobsters were red biro. She never drew shrimps, though, because she liked to eat them in a muffin. I think it had troubled her for a long time. Finally, after much prayer and some consultation with the great man of the Lord in Shrewsbury, she agreed with St. Paul that what God had cleansed we must not call common. After that we went to Molly's Seafoods every Saturday. Deuteronomy had its drawbacks. It's full of abominations and unmentionables. Whenever we read about a bastard or someone with crushed testicles, my mother turned over the page and said, "Leave that to the Lord." But when she'd gone, I'd sneak a look. I was glad I didn't have testicles. They sounded like intestines, only on the outside, and the men in the Bible were always having them cut off and not being able to go to church. Horrid. Well, pressed Mrs. Vole. I'm waiting. I don't know, I replied. And why, and this is perhaps more serious, do you terrorize, yes, terrorize the other children? I don't, I protested. Then can you tell me why I had Mrs. Spencer and Mrs. Sparrow here this morning telling me how their children have nightmares? I have nightmares too. That's not the point. You have been talking about hell to young minds. It was true, I couldn't deny it. I had told all the others about the horrors of the demon and the fate of the damned. I had illustrated it. I had illustrated it by almost strangling Susan Hunt, but that was an accident, and I gave her all my cough sweets afterwards. "I'm very sorry," I said. "I thought it was interesting." Mrs. Vole and Miss shook their heads. "You'd better go," said Mrs. Vole. "I shall be writing to your mother." I was very depressed. What was all the fuss about? Better to hear about hell now than burn in it later. I walked past Class 3's collage of an Easter bunny, and I thought of Elsie's collage of Noah's Ark, with the removable chimp. It was obvious where I belonged. 10 more years and I could go to missionary school. Mrs. Vole kept her promise. She wrote to my mother, explaining my religious leanings and asking my mother if she would moderate me. My mother hooted and took me to the cinema as a treat. They were showing the 10 Commandments. I asked if Elsie could come, but my mother said no. After that day, everyone at school avoided me. If it had not been for the conviction that I was right, I might have been very sad. As it was, I just forgot about it, did my lessons as best I could, which wasn't that well, and thought about our church. I told my mother how things were once. "We are called to be apart," she said. My mother didn't have many friends either. People didn't understand the way she thought. Neither did I. But I loved her because she always knew exactly why things happened. When it came round to prize giving, I took my sampler back from Elsie Norris and entered it for the needlework class. I still think it was a masterpiece of its kind. It had the lettering all in black, and the border all in white, and in the bottom corner a sort of artist's impression of the terrified damned. Elsie had framed it, so it looked quite professional. Mrs. Virtue stood at the top of the class, collecting. Irene, yes. Vera, yes. Shelley, yes. Shelley was... Ooh. Okay. Shelley was a brownie. I don't know if that means like... Side note, I don't know if that means like... Okay, well, okay. Anyway. "Here's mine, Mrs. Virtue," I said, placing it on the desk. "Yes," she said, meaning no. "I will enter it if that's what you want, but to be frank, I don't think it's the sort of thing the judges will be hoping for." "What do you mean?" I demanded. "It's got everything, adventure, pathos, mystery," she interrupted. "I mean your use of colour is limited. You don't exploit the potential of the thread. Take Shelley's village scene, for instance. Notice the variety, the colours." "She's used 4 colours, I've used 3. Mrs. Virtue frowned. "And besides, no one else has used black." Mrs. Virtue sat down. "And I've used mythical counter-relief," I insisted, pointing at the terrified damned. Mrs. Virtue laid her head on her hands. "What are you talking about, if you mean that messy blotch in the corner?" I was furious. Luckily, I had been reading about how Sir Joshua Reynolds insulted Turner. Just because you can't tell what it is, doesn't mean it's not what it is. I picked up Shelley's village scene. "That doesn't look like a sheep, it's all white and fluffy." "Go back to your desk, Jeanette." "But—" "Go back to your desk!" What could I do? My needlework teacher suffered from a problem of vision. She recognized things according to expectation and environment. If you were in a particular place, you expected to see particular things. Sheep and hills, sea and fish. If there was an elephant in the supermarket, she'd either not see it at all, or call Mrs. Jones and talk about fish cakes. But most likely, she'd do what most people do when confronted with something they don't understand. Panic. What constitutes a problem is not the thing, or the environment where we find the thing, but the conjunction of the two. Something unexpected in an unusual place, our favourite aunt in our favourite poker parlour, or something unusual in an unexpected place, our favourite poker in our favourite aunt. I knew that my sampler was absolutely right in Elsie Norris's front room, but absolutely wrong in Mrs. Virtue's sewing class. Mrs. Virtue should either have had the imagination to condemn me. Mrs. Virtue should either have had the imagination to commend me for my effort in context, or the far-sightedness to realize that there is a debate going on as to whether something has an absolute as well as a relative value. Given that, she should have given me the benefit of the doubt. As it was, she got upset and blamed me for her headache. This was very like Sir Joshua Reynolds, who complained that Turner always gave him a headache. I didn't win anything with my sampler though, and I was very disappointed. I took it back to Elsie on the last day of school and asked her if she still wanted it. She snatched it from me and put it firmly on the wall. "It's upside down, Elsie," I pointed out. She fumbled for her glasses and stared at it. "So it is, but it's all the same to the Lord. Still, I'll put it right for them that doesn't know." And she carefully adjusted the picture. "I thought you might not like it any more." "Heathen child, the Lord himself was scorned. Don't expect the unwashed to appreciate." Elsie always called the unconverted the unwashed. "Well, it would be nice sometimes," I ventured, displaying a tendency towards relativism. Relativism. Elsie got very cross. She was an absolutionist and had no time for people who thought cows didn't exist unless you looked at them. Once a thing was created, it was valid for all time. Its value went not up nor down. Perception, she said, was a fraud. Yep. Had not St. Paul said... Wow. Perception, she said, was a fraud. Had not St. Paul said we see in a glass darkly... What the fuck is this sentence? Perception, she said, was a fraud. Had not St. Paul said we see in a glass darkly? Had not Wordsworth said we see by glimpses? What the fuck does that mean? This piece of fruitcake, she waved it between bites. This cake doesn't need me to eat it to make it edible. It exists without me. That was a bad example, but I knew what she meant. It meant that to create was a fundament, to appreciate a supplement. What are we talking about? Once created, the creature was separate from the creator and needed no seconding to fully exist. "Have some cake," she said cheerfully. But I didn't, because even if Elsie was a philosopher... Holy shit! Pause it. "Have some cake," she said cheerfully. But I didn't, because even if Elsie was philosophically amiss, her contention that the cake existed without either... Fuck me, this is too much! "Have some cake," she said cheerfully. But I didn't, because even if Elsie was philosophically amiss, her contention that the cake existed without either of us was certainly true. There was probably a whole township in there, with values of its own, and a style of gossip. Over the years I did my best to win a prize. Some wished to better the world and still scorn it. But I never succeeded. There's a formula, a secret, I don't know what, that the people who have been to public school or brownies seem to understand. Side note. Oh, maybe you already know what brownies is. Okay, well, before I thought maybe she was just being racist or whatever, but that's just like Girl Scouts. Maybe you know that. Sorry if I'm mansplaining. I don't know. Yeah. It runs right back to it. It runs right the way through life, though it starts with a hyacinth growing, passes through milk monitor. Passes through milk monitor and finishes somewhere half blue. My hyacinths were pink, 2 of them. I called the ensemble the Annunciation. You have to have a theme. This was because... Annunciation, yeah. This was because the blooms were huddled up close and reminded me of Mary and Elizabeth soon after the visit by the angel. I thought it was a very clever marriage of horticulture and theology. I put a little explanation at the bottom and the appropriate verse so that people could look it up if they wanted to, but it didn't win. What did win was a straggly white pair called Snow Sisters. So I took the Annunciation home and fed it to our rabbit. I was a bit uneasy afterwards in case it was heresy and the rabbit fell sick. Later, I tried to win the Easter egg painting competition. I had had so little success with my biblical themes that it seemed an idea to try something new. It couldn't be anything pre-Raphaelite, because Janie Morris was thin. and not suited to being played by an egg. Coleridge and the Man from Porlock? Coleridge? Coleridge was fat, but I felt the tableau would lack dramatic interest. "It's obvious," said Elsie. "Wagner." So we cut a cardboard box to set the scene. Elsie dug the backdrop, me doing the rocks out of half eggshells. We stayed up all night on the dramatist... What the fuck are all these words? We stayed up... Sorry. We stayed up all night on the dramatis personae because of the detail. We had chosen the most exciting bit. Brunhilde confronts her father. I did Brunhilde and Elsie did Woden. Brunhilde had a helmet made out of a thimble with a little feather wing. What? Yo. Brunhilde had a helmet made out of a thimble with little feather wings from Elsie's pillow. "She needs a spear," said What the fuck? "She needs a spear," said Elsie. "I'll give you a cocktail stick, only don't tell anyone what I use it for." As a final touch, I cut off some of my own hair and made it into Brunhilde's hair. Woden was a masterpiece, a double yolk brown egg, with a Ritz cracker shield and a drawn-on eye patch. We made him a matchbox chariot that was just too small. "Dramatic emphasis," said Elsie. The next day I took it to school and placed it beside the others. There was no comparison. Imagine my horror when it didn't win. I was not a selfish child, and, understanding the nature of genius, would have happily bowed to another's talent, but not to 3 eggs covered in cotton wool, entitled Easter Bunnies. "It's not fair," I told Elsie, later that same evening at the sisterhood meeting. "You'll get used to it." "And anyway," butted in Mrs. White, who had heard the story, "they're not holy." I didn't despair. I did Streetcar Named Desire out of pipe cleaners, an embroidered cushion cover of Betty Davis in Now Voyager, an origami William Tell with a real apple, and best of all, a potato sculpture of Henry Ford outside the Chrysler Building in New York. An impressive list by any standards, but I was as hopeful and as foolish as King Canute forcing back the waves. Whatever I did made no impression at all, except to enrage my mother because I had abandoned biblical themes. She quite liked Now Voyager, because she had done her courting during that film, but she thought I should have made the Tower of Babel out of origami, even though I told her it would be too difficult. "The Lord walked on water," was all she said when I tried to explain. But she had her own problems. A lot of the missionaries had been eaten, which meant she had to explain A lot of the missionaries had been eaten, which meant she had to explain to their families. "It's not easy," she said, "even though it's for the Lord." When the children of Israel left Egypt, they were guided by the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. For them, this did not seem to be a problem. For me, it was an enormous problem. The pillar of cloud was a fog, perplexing and impossible. I didn't understand the ground rules. The daily world was a world of strange notions, without form, and therefore void. I comforted myself as best I could by always rearranging their version of the facts. One day, I learned that tetrahedron is a mathematical shape that can be formed by stretching an elastic band over a series of nails. But tetrahedron is an emperor. The Emperor Tetrahedron lived in a palace made absolutely from elastic bands. To the right, cunning fountains shot elastic jets, subtle as silk. To the left, 10 minstrels played day and night on elastic lutes. The Emperor was beloved by all. At night, when the thin dogs slept, and the music lulled all but the most watchful to sleep, the mighty palace lay closed and barred against the foul isosceles, sworn enemy to the graceful tetrahedron. But in the day, the guards pulled back the great doors, flooding the plain with light, so that gifts could be brought to the Emperor. Many bought gifts, stretches of material so fine that a change of the temperature would dissolve it, stretches of material so strong that whole cities could be built from it, and stories of love and folly. One day, a lovely woman bought the emperor a revolving circus operated by midgets. The midgets acted... Can I say that? Well, whatever. Acted all of the tragedies and many of the comedies. They acted them all at once, and it was fortunate that the tetrahedron had so many faces, otherwise he might have died of fatigue. They acted them all at once. They acted them all at once, and the emperor, walking around his theatre, could see them all at once, if he wished. Round and round he walked, and so learned a very valuable thing, that no emotion is the final one. End of freaking chapter. There's mice on the page. Okay.